What if I told you that the fate of Western civilization was decided on a piece of land smaller than a modern football stadium? History loves paradoxes, and this case became the most sensational of all the events of the ancient world known to us. The young Macedonian king, whom many considered an upstart, found himself trapped in a deadly trap between the mountains and the sea. He was facing an army at least 5 times larger than his own, and all routes of retreat behind him had been cut off. The logic of war dictated that on that day, the Macedonian army should have been wiped off the face of the earth, and Alexander's name forgotten forever. But instead of surrender, the world witnessed the birth of a legend that has survived for millennia. On that day, it was not just 2 armies that clashed on the narrow coastline, but 2 different philosophies, 2 different worlds. The Persians relied on endless resources, gold and overwhelming numbers that struck terror into all the peoples of Asia. The Greeks and Macedonians brought with them iron discipline, new technologies of killing, and the fury of people who had nothing to lose. It was a clash between the old order, mired in luxury, and a new hungry force ready to turn the world upside down. The stakes were higher than just territory or money. At stake was the title of King of Asia and the right to be called a living god. None of the participants in the battle that morning could have imagined how the day would end. Watch the video to the end to find out how a single mistake by the Persian king and one crazy cavalry charge turned certain defeat into a victory that changed the map of the world. I discovered this by accident while studying ancient maps of troop movements before the battle. Alexander is commonly regarded as a strategic genius who was always in control of the situation. But the truth is that the beginning of the campaign was a complete failure. Alexander and Darius literally passed each other in the mountains, making a maneuver that could have cost the Macedonian his life and his crown. The Macedonian army was moving south along the coast, confident that the Persians were somewhere ahead in the Syrian plains. At the same time, Darius' huge army passed through a mountain pass that Alexander had left unguarded and came up behind him. It was a disaster of strategic proportions, rarely mentioned in school history textbooks. The Persians captured the city of Issus, where the Macedonian infirmaries with wounded and sick soldiers left to recover were located. The fate of these people was terrible. The Persians cut off their hands and burned their wounds with resin, so that they, living witnesses of barbarism, would reach Alexander. Alexander only learned of what had happened when a messenger brought him the terrible news in the middle of the night. His communications had been cut off, his supplies had been stopped, and his way home to Macedonia was completely blocked by a huge enemy horde. From the point of view of the military science of the time, the campaign was lost, as an army without food and no means of retreat was doomed to destruction. Alexander's confidence in his infallibility played a cruel joke on him, forcing him to act under time pressure. Instead of panicking, Alexander ordered the army to turn around and march back north toward the enemy. The soldiers were exhausted from the long march, soaked by the autumn rains, and knew they were walking into a trap. But it was at this moment that the iron will of the Macedonian machine, which blindly believed in its commander, came to the fore. They were marching to their deaths, but they marched in step, maintaining order and discipline that their opponents could not match. The situation was exacerbated by the fact that no one knew exactly how many Persian troops there were. But rumors painted a picture of fantastical numbers. There was talk of 500,000 soldiers, chariots with scythes, and war elephants capable of trampling the phalanx. The fear of the unknown was more terrifying than the enemy itself, and it penetrated the hearts of even Philip's most hardened veterans. Alexander had to not only defeat the enemy, but also defeat the fear in his own ranks. We often think of great commanders as people who never make mistakes, but the reality is much more complicated. Alexander was a man who knew how to turn his failures into opportunities, acting faster and more decisively than the enemy. His reaction to the news of the Persians in the rear shows not so much a genius for planning as a genius for improvisation. It is the ability to adapt to chaos that distinguishes a great commander from a merely good general. It is interesting to see how this topic is perceived in different parts of the world, because we are used to looking at history through the eyes of the victorious Europeans. Do you think Alexander won because of his genius or simply because of incredible luck and Darius' mistakes? Write about it in the comments. And be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on other historical coincidences. Guess what happened next when the two armies finally saw each other at dawn? They found themselves in the Pinar River Valley, a place that seemed to have been created by the god of war to destroy numerical superiority. On one side towered the impregnable Aman Mountains. On the other lapped the Mediterranean Sea, creating a natural corridor only a few kilometers wide. This bottleneck became Alexander's main ally, negating the Persians' enormous advantage. Darius, without meaning to, deprived his army of its main trump card, the ability to flank the enemy. His huge cavalry, numbering tens of thousands of horsemen, jostled in a narrow space, getting in each other's way. Instead of a broad front where every soldier could engage in battle, the Persians were forced to line up in deep columns. The rear ranks simply could not see the battle and could not help the front ones, turning into a useless crowd of spectators. Alexander instantly recognized this gift of fate and began to stretch his line so that it touched both the mountains and the sea. He understood that if the Persians could outflank him on even one side, the battle would turn into a massacre. The Macedonian phalanx took the center, while the cavalry was distributed along the flanks, preparing for the decisive blow. Every meter of this narrow field was used with mathematical precision. The right flank, adjacent to the mountains, was particularly important, as Alexander planned to deliver his signature strike there. Here the ground was firm and suitable for cavalry maneuvers, unlike the marshy shore by the sea. Alexander personally led this flank, knowing that this was where the outcome of the battle would be decided. He deliberately weakened the left flank, ordering his general Parmenion to simply hold his ground at all costs.
Hold the line at all costs.
The narrow battlefield also played into the hands of the Macedonian phalanx, whose strength lay in the solidity of its formation. Here, their flanks were securely covered by natural obstacles, and they could concentrate all their power on the forward strike. The Persian infantry, accustomed to more flexible formations, found themselves squeezed and deprived of maneuverability. Geography dictated tactics, and Alexander read this book better than his opponent. Darius, placing his golden throne in the center of the Persian formation, became a hostage to his own position. He wanted to see the battle and control it, but ended up in the thick of events, unable to react quickly. His guard and chariots cluttered the center, creating an ideal target for a pinpoint strike. The King of Kings had built the cage for his own defeat. The whole scene resembled a chess game where one player accidentally blocked his own pieces. Nature, which the Persians usually conquered by digging canals and tearing down mountains, this time rebelled against them. The river, the sea, and the mountains became silent allies of the Macedonian king. But geography is useless if you don't have the tools to take advantage of it. Are you ready to learn the truth about the technology that turned Macedonian peasants into invincible killers? The secret that would change the war industry forever was not magic or divine intervention, but a 6-meter piece of wood. The sarissa, a Macedonian spear, was the technological breakthrough that turned Alexander's army into a killing machine. This weapon was so long and heavy that it could only be held with 2 hands, which meant completely abandoning the large shield. Soldiers carried a small shield on their elbow, entrusting their lives entirely to the forest of pikes protruding in front of them. The phalanx with sarissas was like a hedgehog that could not be approached closer than 5 meters. The first 5 rows of pikes protruded beyond the front of the formation, creating an impenetrable wall of sharp points. Any enemy attempting to attack the phalanx head-on would encounter several spears at once before even reaching the first Macedonian with their sword. It was psychologically unbearable to walk to certain death without being able to strike a blow. But the sarissa was only part of the system. The main secret was the unique training of the soldiers. Macedonian infantrymen were professionals who had trained for years, not militiamen called up from the plow. They knew how to maneuver huge units as a single organism, turning, rearranging, and doubling their ranks at the whistle. This synchrony of movement fascinated and frightened their enemies more than the weapons themselves. The second element of this deadly machine was the cavalry of the heteroi, the king's companions. They were heavy-shot cavalry, the elite of Macedonian society, trained from childhood in horsemanship and combat. They did not use stirrups, which had not yet been invented, but managed to deliver terrible blows with their spears without falling out of the saddle. The heteroi acted as a hammer, while the phalanx served as an indestructible anvil. Alexander perfected the hammer and anvil tactic, bringing it to perfection in such battles. The phalanx pinned down the enemy's forces from the front, forcing them to get bogged down in a struggle with a forest of pikes. At this time, the cavalry made a flanking maneuver and delivered a crushing blow to the flank or rear. The enemy found itself caught in a vice from which there was no escape. This military machine was created by his father Philip, but it was Alexander who found the perfect use for it. At Issus, this machine faced the most serious test in its history, and the result exceeded all expectations. Like if you enjoy learning about ancient technologies that change the course of history. Are you ready to learn the truth about who Alexander really defeated? We are accustomed to imagining the Persian army as a collection of weak and pampered Eastern warriors in pajamas, but this is a dangerous misconception. Darius III's army was one of the most formidable forces of its time, hardened by suppressing rebellions and ruling a vast empire. Its ranks included the best warriors in Asia, whose skill and courage were beyond doubt. The core of the Persian army was its famous cavalry, clad in plate armor. The horsemen and their horses were protected by armor, making them look like medieval knights 1,100 years before the Middle Ages. They were armed with javelins and swords, and their attack could crush any infantry formation. At Issus, it was the Persian cavalry on the right flank that nearly overwhelmed the Macedonians. But the most dangerous part of Darius' army was not the Persians, but the Greek mercenaries. About 30,000 Greek hoplites, professional killers, exiles, and adventurers fought for Persian gold. They hated the Macedonians and fought them with particular ferocity, considering them barbarians and invaders. It was a civil war between Greeks on Persian soil. The elite infantry of the Persians, the so-called immortals, or their counterparts of that time, were also present on the battlefield. They were armed with spears with gold and silver pommels at the ends of the shafts, symbolizing their status. They were the king's personal bodyguards, fanatically devoted to him and ready to die defending their master. Underestimating them was a fatal mistake. The scale of the Persian army was staggering. It stretched for kilometers, sparkling with gold and purple. Darius's train was a whole mobile city, carrying his wife, mother, children, and concubines. The presence of the royal family on the battlefield was intended to boost the morale of the troops, demonstrating the king's confidence in victory. But as we shall see later, this became his main weakness. Darius himself was a tall and stately man, described as a brave warrior in his youth. He was not a coward, as he is often portrayed in films, but he bore the burden of responsibility for the entire dynasty. His strategy was conservative and logical, following rules that had worked for centuries. His misfortune was that he encountered a player who ignored those rules. The wealth of the Persian army was its curse. Alexander's soldiers saw them not only as enemies, but also as prey. The Persians' gold jewelry, expensive fabrics, and inlaid weapons fueled the Macedonians' greed. This gave the battle an additional motive. Poor Europe had come to plunder rich Asia. This Persian Colossus seemed like an indestructible, monumental structure that would stand forever. But every Colossus has feet of clay, and Alexander knew exactly where to strike to bring down the entire structure. In the next chapter, you will learn how Alexander broke the most important rule of commander safety. Before the battle began, there was a heavy, ringing silence, broken only by the neighing of horses and the clanging of weapons. Alexander, contrary to custom, did not rush to attack, giving his men time to calm down and catch their breath. He rode in front of the formation, addressing the commanders by name and reminding them of past victories. It was a masterful use of psychology. He turned their fear of the huge horde into cold fury. The Macedonian front was stretched out in a thin line to prevent the Persians from flanking them. In the center stood a phalanx bristling with sarissas, resembling a giant porcupine. On the left flank, near the sea, was the Thessalian cavalry under the command of the experienced old general Parmenion. Their task was simply to survive, holding back the monstrous pressure of the Persian cavalry. Alexander and the Getae took up position on the right wing, at the foot of the mountains. He noticed that the Persians had stretched their left flank in a thin arc along the mountainside, attempting to create a threat of encirclement. In response, he assigned a special detachment of light infantry and archers to drive these Persians back into the mountains. This small tactical success ensured the safety of his main attack. Darius placed his best forces, the Greek mercenaries, right in the center, opposite the Macedonian phalanx. He understood that only they were capable of withstanding the sarissas and possibly breaking through the Macedonian formation. He concentrated his powerful cavalry on the right flank, near the sea, hoping to crush Parmenion. The king himself stood in the center on a high chariot, visible to every soldier in his army. The ground on the riverbank was soggy and uneven, which made it difficult for the phalanx to maneuver. Alexander understood that if the phalanx slowed down or broke formation while crossing the river, Darius' Greek mercenaries would destroy it. Therefore, speed was critical. They had to get through the dangerous zone faster than the enemy could react. The soldiers saw a mass of enemies before them, outnumbering them, but they believed in their king. Alexander was dressed in shining armor and a helmet with a white plume, serving as a beacon for his men. He did not hide in the rear, but was the tip of a spear aimed at the heart of the Persian army. At that moment, history stood still. Two worlds, two civilizations stood facing each other, separated only by the narrow Pinar River. One wrong move, one delayed order could decide the fate of nations for centuries to come. The attack began not with shouts, but with the dull thud of thousands of feet pounding the ground. The first arrows flew into the sky, marking the beginning of the end of the Persian Empire. What happened next is prohibited in modern military textbooks as an example of unjustified risk. Instead of methodically developing the offensive, Alexander personally led a frenzied cavalry attack across the river. He directed his heteroi not just at the enemy's flank, but at the junction between the Persian infantry and cavalry. It was a dagger thrust at the most vulnerable point, delivered with surgical precision and animal fury. The Macedonian horses, kicking up foam and water, burst onto the Persian shore, crushing the enemy's light infantry. The Persian archers and slingers in the front ranks could not withstand the onslaught of the armored horsemen and fled. Their flight disrupted the ranks of the infantry behind them, creating chaos even before the main forces entered the battle. Alexander, like a god of war, cut left and right, clearing a path to the center. Alexander's main target was not the flank, but King Darius himself. He understood that the Persian army was held together only by the authority of its ruler. Kill the head, and the body will die on its own. Therefore, after breaking through the first line of defense, the Macedonian wedge turned sharply to the left, straight towards the king's chariot. This maneuver was so bold and unexpected that the Persians were taken aback. Their left flank, consisting of Kardakes, Persian infantry, simply crumbled under the onslaught of the Hetairoi. They were not trained in close combat with heavy cavalry and fled in panic, opening the way to the heart of the army. The Persian defense was cracking at the seams, but the center was still holding strong. Darius' bodyguards fought with desperate courage, trying to stop the Macedonian breakthrough. It was a meat grinder, where men and horses were mixed into a bloody mess. The speed of Alexander's attack was such that the Persian commanders simply did not have time to give orders. By the time the messengers reached the units, the situation had already changed dramatically. The initiative had completely passed into the hands of the Macedonians, who dictated the pace of the battle. Alexander saw Darius' golden chariot getting closer and closer. He saw fear in the eyes of the Persian king. This moment of visual contact between the two rulers was the culmination of the entire battle. But while Alexander was winning on his side, his center was dying. In the next chapter, you will learn how the Macedonian phalanx came within a hair's breadth of destruction. While Alexander was enjoying his triumph on the right flank, a real tragedy was unfolding in the center. The Macedonian phalanx, crossing the Pinar River, broke its monolithic formation. Steep banks, slippery rocks, and strong currents tore apart the unified line of sarissas, creating dangerous gaps. Darius' Greek mercenaries immediately rushed into these gaps. These Greeks were top-class professionals who had been waiting for this moment. They struck at the gaps in the phalanx, engaging in close combat with swords, where the long sarissas of the Macedonians were useless. A brutal slaughter began, in which the phalangites, deprived of the advantage of their formation, suffered heavy losses. The Macedonians fell by the dozens, their commanders shouting to restore order, but the noise of battle drowned out everything. The Greek mercenaries pushed them back toward the river, threatening to throw them into the water. It was a critical moment when Alexander's entire army could have been split in two and destroyed piece by piece. On the left flank, the situation was even worse. The Persian heavy cavalry, having crossed the river at the sea, descended on Parmenians' Thessalians. The Persians were far superior in numbers and pressed forward with their mass, forcing the Macedonians to retreat step by step. Parmenion sent messenger after messenger to Alexander, begging for help. The Greek mercenaries were fighting not only for money, but also for an idea, wanting to take revenge on the Macedonians for enslaving Greece. Their fury was terrible, and they fought with the desperation of the doomed. It seemed that the center of the Macedonian army was about to collapse, and then Alexander's victory on the flank would be meaningless. He saw that his infantry was perishing. He saw his left flank buckling, and at that moment, he made a decision that distinguishes a great strategist from a mere hack. He stopped pursuing glory in order to save his army. The gap in the phalanx formation became a symbol of the fragility of any plan, even the most perfect one. The battle turned into chaos, with every soldier fighting for his life, forgetting about tactics. If the center had collapsed, Alexander would have been cut off behind enemy lines. History balanced on the edge of a sword. Alexander performed a maneuver that saved the Macedonian army from defeat. Instead of continuing to pursue the fleeing Persians on his flank, he turned the hetairoi 90 degrees to the left. He struck the flank and rear of the Greek mercenaries who were pressing the Macedonian phalanx. It was a classic hammer blow, but executed in conditions of complete chaos. The Greek mercenaries, who had just tasted victory, suddenly found themselves under attack from heavy cavalry from the rear. Their formation broke down, and they were trapped between the phalanx in front and the cavalry behind. Those who had been attacking fiercely just a minute ago now turned their horses around and tried to flee. Parmenion, taking advantage of the enemy's confusion, launched a counterattack. The Thessalian cavalry chased the Persians, turning their retreat into a panicked flight. Alexander's strike on the Greek flank was the decisive moment of the battle. He not only saved his infantry, but also finally broke the resistance of the enemy center. The Persian army, deprived of command and caught in a pincer movement, turned into an uncontrollable mob. The Macedonians acted as a single mechanism, grinding down the enemy. Discipline once again triumphed over numbers. Alexander's soldiers, tired and wounded, found the strength for one last push. The battlefield turned into a scene of mass slaughter. The Persians, trapped in a narrow valley, trampled each other in their attempt to escape. The gorges and ravines were filled with the bodies of men and horses. Alexander proved that he was capable of sacrificing his personal ambitions for the sake of overall victory. His timely turn was the key that opened the door to victory. Now that the enemy army had been broken, all that remained was to deal with the main prize, King Darius himself. In the heat of battle, when the outcome was still undecided, an event occurred that put an end to the history of the Achaemenid Empire. Darius III, ruler of Asia, lost his composure when he saw Alexander approaching. The sight of the bloodied, mad Macedonian king cutting through the ranks of his guards broke the Persians' will. Darius turned his chariot around and fled. It was not a tactical retreat, but a panic-stricken flight. He abandoned his army, his family, and his honor on the battlefield. As soon as the soldiers saw the king's chariot retreating to the rear, a cry of despair swept through the ranks. The Persian army was built on loyalty to the king. If the king flees, the battle is lost. Such was the logic of the Eastern warriors. A chain reaction of panic instantly swept through all units. Soldiers threw down their weapons and armor to run faster. Darius ran so fast that soon the terrain became impassable for his chariot. He threw away his bow, his cloak, and even his royal regalia, mounted a horse, and disappeared into the mountains. The abandoned chariot became a trophy for the victors, a symbol of the great king's disgrace. Darius' flight led to the huge masses of Persian infantry in the rear being simply trampled by their own fleeing cavalry. The narrow mountain passes became deadly traps, where the crush killed more people than the Macedonian swords. The psychological breakdown of one man led to the deaths of tens of thousands. This is a lesson in how important the role of a leader is in a critical situation. Darius fled into the night, leaving Alexander master of the battlefield and, in effect, master of Asia. The consequences of the Battle of Issus were enormous. The Macedonians captured the Persian camp, which was bursting with unimaginable riches. Soldiers who had been poor shepherds just yesterday filled their helmets with gold and precious stones. 3,000 talents of gold were captured, an amount that could support an army for years. After Issus, Alexander's authority became unquestionable. The cities of Phoenicia and Egypt began to open their gates to him, seeing him not as an invader, but as a liberator or a new god. The Persian Empire, which had seemed monolithic, began to crumble. The Battle of Issus showed the whole world that the Greek military machine was superior to the Persian one. It was the end of the era of Eastern domination and the beginning of the Hellenistic era. Greek culture flooded into Asia in the wake of the phalanxes. Darius tried to offer Alexander peace, half of his kingdom, and a huge ransom for his family. Alexander responded with the arrogance of a true victor. There cannot be two suns in the sky, nor two rulers on earth. There was no turning back. The losses of the Persians were monstrous. Ancient historians speak of hundreds of thousands killed, which is probably an exaggeration, but the scale of the massacre was enormous. The losses of the Macedonians were relatively small, though still significant. It was after Issus that Alexander began to believe in his divine nature. He had accomplished the impossible, defeating the greatest empire in the world while outnumbered. This belief would ultimately destroy him, but for now he was at the height of his glory. The world changed in a single day. The battle in the narrow valley of the Pinar River became a point of no return for all of ancient history. The story of the Battle of Issus is not just a description of tactical maneuvers. It is a story of how audacity, discipline, and self-belief can crush any force, even the most powerful. Alexander the Great proved that gods are not born. They are made on the battlefield, overcoming fear and circumstances. His victory is a reminder to us all. The size of the obstacle does not matter if you have the will to overcome it. What do you think about this battle? Was Alexander's victory inevitable or just a lucky coincidence? Write your opinion in the comments, and if you want to see an analysis of the final battle at Gaugamela, be sure to let us know. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because even more exciting pages of history await us.